Good afternoon. I want to talk about diversity. And I know that after 3 years of diversity and tech conversations, everyone's exhausted. And I get it. Because it can be hard to know, well, what can I do to make a difference? Especially after things like last week, when we learned that the Tech Inclusion Pledge was signed, and you had all these huge companies that signed it. And these are companies that we all know about. Some of us have worked there, or maybe we want to work there. And it's easy to be lulled into a sense of complacency, thinking, well, these big guys are going to take care of the problem. Well, I would encourage you to not do that, to understand that you have a role to play in making technology a more diverse and accepting industry. And I don't want to knock the Tech Inclusion Project. In fact, there are a lot of things that we can learn from it. One is, it's called inclusion. And I think that diversity is a term that has reached its end of life. It's just not helpful. Diversity is something that it's easy to gain. And I think we should move away from diversity and more toward inclusion and empathy, because that's what we really need in technology. You know, diversity is like if you're having a house party, diversity is inviting people to the house party. You can just check that off. Inclusion and empathy is making sure that everyone feels comfortable at the party, that you know that certain people have traveled farther than others to get there, that you understand people may have allergies, and so you have different menu options to make them happy to eat at your party. So it takes work to be inclusive. Diversity is way too easy to check box. So we want to move away from diversity and toward inclusion. And I think that lending privilege is something that is really powerful that everyone in this room can do. And this is not just some hippie dream of an inclusive world where we all sit around campfires and sing Kumbaya and make s'mores. There's actual value to being inclusive. Multiple studies have shown that inclusive teams are innovative teams. I mean, this is canonical at this point. And if you want to at me on Twitter and ask, I can send you all the links to the data. But there is a strong link between inclusion and innovation. But you know, this is not a new idea, especially if you're in open source. Inclusion is really at the heart of open source, even from the beginning. A few years ago, an author wrote a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was one of the first works about open source software development. And the author, Eric Raymond, explored the miracle that was Linux. Think about it. We don't really understand it now because we're so used to it, but Linux was this crazy project that let anyone contribute, that everyone was working on this complicated kernel to make a useful operating system, and it worked. And so Raymond began to use those principles of open source software in his projects, and he distilled lessons or guidelines for open source software in his book. And the lesson that's most well known from the Cathedral and the Bazaar is this one. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And I hope that many of you have heard this phrase. If you haven't read the book, if you work in open source, you really should. But I actually like the more formal version of this statement, and it's in the book. And that's this one. Given a large enough beta tester and code developer base, almost every problem will be characterized quickly and the fix obvious to someone. That is a statement of inclusion, meaning that if we have open source be this big tent, this babbling, boisterous bazaar of people who are involved in the software and dedicated to making it better, then there's no problem that we can't solve. And that is the promise of inclusion. But the sad reality is that just like our repositories are protected by passwords and permissions, often our companies are protected by privilege. And there are voices that we keep out of this bazaar, and we don't allow them to take part in our projects and in our companies. Because the reality is that whatever problem you have within your company, within your source code, within your repositories, someone out there can fix it. But they're denied entry into your company. And to understand how this works and what we can do to make things better, we have to understand privilege. But before we do that, it's really important that we all understand what privilege is not. Privilege does not mean that you haven't worked hard. It doesn't mean that you haven't sacrificed. It doesn't mean that you aren't good at what you do. Privilege is like riding a bicycle up a hill, right? It's hot, you forgot your sunscreen, you're going to a destination, and you're working really hard. But some people don't have your privilege, and for them, it's a harder journey. And there are things that they have to deal with that you don't because you have privilege. And having privilege does not remove you from the responsibility of understanding that some people don't have privilege and that their journey through technology is harder than yours. You know, I have gender privilege. In tech, being a male has benefits, and there are certain benefits that I can enjoy that people who don't have gender privilege don't get to have. You know, if I'm walking tonight back to my hotel at 11 p.m., it's highly unlikely someone's going to try to attack me. But if I didn't have gender privilege, that would be a much more difficult decision. So that's how privilege works. It doesn't mean that you don't work hard. It doesn't mean that you're not a good person, but it just means that things are a little bit easier for you. So what is privilege? Privilege is access to benefits based on traits that you possess. And there are two major categories of privilege. There's birth privilege, and these are the traits that you're born with. These are things like parental privilege, racial privilege, gender privilege, and ironically, your birth privileges, which you didn't even choose for yourself, are usually the root of most bias and most prejudice. But that's another talk. The other category of privilege are selected privileges. And these are things that we choose and change over time. It includes things like where you went to school, could be your religion, your gender identity, but these are different factors that you actually choose for yourself. Now, it's human nature to share your privilege with people who have your privilege. People who have gender privilege usually share the benefits of gender privilege with people who have it. People who have racial privilege usually choose the benefits of racial privilege with people who have racial privilege. But it's far more powerful to lend your privilege to people who lack your privilege. And we'll learn more about that in a few slides. Now, your birth privilege and your selected privileges create your portfolio of privilege. And these are the things that you just enjoy and the benefits that help you have maybe an easier time working in open source or in technology. But I want everyone to look up here and identify at least one privilege that you have. Just think about it. Some of you have two. Some of you may have all of these. But once you get at least one in your mind, think about what would your career in tech be if you started out without that privilege? If you started out without your gender privilege or your racial privilege, or you didn't have the opportunity to go to Stanford or to MIT, or maybe you didn't have the benefit of being able to walk around and see and hear. How much harder would your journey through technology be without these privileges? Now think about that there are people who you work with every day who have to deal without these privileges. And they have to navigate the technology scene at a bit of a disadvantage. Now, having a more empathetic and inclusive industry benefits everyone because honestly, marginalization is on the march. We're all going toward a world that is less inclusive, and we see it in the news, we see it almost everywhere. So you may be the person who can benefit from a more empathetic technology industry because soon we're all going to probably benefit from not having class privilege unless you're a venture capitalist. Now, I want to illustrate privilege through three women. These are real women. The names are fictitious and the scenarios are fictitious, but I'm going to use them as examples of how you can lend privilege in your companies. For each privilege type, I'm going to explain what it is. I'm going to give a real-world example of how it works, and then I'm going to share how it can work in your companies. So the first type of privilege lending is credibility lending. And that's providing visibility to someone without privilege. For example, LGBT people often feel restricted in technology because we have a heteronormative industry. And there are times when LGBT people feel invisible, overlooked, not recognized. Well, by credibility lending, we can help fix that. Here's the example. A few months ago, noted activist DeRay McKesson went on the Colbert Show. And Stephen Colbert switched seats with DeRay. He let DeRay sit in his chair and lent him the credibility of the Colbert platform. And by doing that, Colbert elevated the platform and the mission of DeRay. And that's how credibility lending works. Now, how can this happen at your company or in your GitHub repo? So let's say you work with B. And she developed that rock star feature that everyone in your company loves. Well, why not lend her credibility by bringing her to your board meeting and co-presenting that feature to the people who help run your company? By doing that, you help raise her profile in your company. That's how credibility lending can work. Now, let's talk about access lending. Access lending is providing entry for someone without privilege. Often women in tech experience sexism because they lack gender privilege. And this can lead women to doubt their own abilities despite the massive value that women bring to technology. Well, I think access lending can be a powerful way to solve that problem. For example, Tracy Chow, who's a noted activist in helping technology become more inclusive, recently told the story of how when she was at Stanford, and she was an undergraduate student, and one of her professors insisted that she become a TA. Now, Tracy was aghast. She said, "What? I'm not qualified to be a TA." Because she had heard her male peers talk about how they're selling through the courses and, oh, wasn't that lab so easy? And she was struggling. Well, by becoming a TA, she saw the grades of these male colleagues, and they were worse than hers. And she saw that these fellow students were pretending that they were more competent than they really were. And by doing that, that helped Tracy reassess her own place in technology. And that's the power of access lending. So how can this work within your company? So let's talk about Elle. Now, Elle spent the last month implementing your container strategy. She's sharp, she's good. Well, why not lend her access by sending her to that Docker conference that keeps inviting you to go speak at? And you don't even do Docker. You can't even spell Docker. But by lending her access, you allow her to realize that she too has a place in technology. And that's how access lending works. The third type of lending that I want to talk about is expertise lending. And that's providing a voice to those who don't have privilege. Often people of color, we feel that we don't have a voice in technology because we lack the racial privilege of leaders in technology. And so we're often afraid to speak up or take roles, leadership roles in technology. But I think that expertise lending is a great way to fix this. Let me give you an example. At South by Southwest this past March, I was able to go to the president's keynote, which was awesome. And his wife spoke at the music festival, which I could not go to. But the first lady said something that was a great explanation of this type of privilege lending. And she said that if you've got a voice at the table, ask, is there diversity around the table? Are there voices and opinions that don't sound like yours? And she challenged the audience that if you have that seat at the table, to look for various voices, to look for different opinions. And she was really describing, though she did not know it, the bazaar that Raymond described in his book. So how can this work at your company? Well, let's consider M. And she's one of your best developers. She worked at your company for a while. Why not give her a lead role? Why not give her the opportunity to lead in your company? And by doing that, you can help her find your voice at your company. So I've described 3 types of privilege lending. And I hope that you realize that this doesn't take that much effort. It's really a matter of being aware, of having your eyes open to the fact that there are people probably who work at your company right next to you every day, or they might be contributors to the GitHub repo that you're working on, who lack privilege. And that you can lend them privilege. You can help them get access. You can help them become experts. You can help them feel credible by lending them privilege. And I want to caution you, though, that lending privilege is not a silver bullet. It's not something that you try once. If it fails, okay, well, I guess it didn't work. It has to become a philosophy of life. You have to buy into it. You have to believe that this bazaar and the cathedral and the bazaar is real, that there's benefits to having this open source software scene truly be inclusive, and that we can truly only get innovation if we embrace inclusion. You know, I was at a conference and someone was talking about how a person of color worked at their company, and this person was passed over for a promotion. And this person just raised all kinds of a ruckus saying, well, this person deserves it, and everyone who this person came in with got promoted, but he did not. And I said, well, it's great that you raised the issue and that you tried to make things better during the promotion cycle, but it's better to have done it in advance, right? Being an advocate for inclusion, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You have to do it every day. You have to bake it into your daily way of work, because that's the only way that we can truly get change in this industry. So let technology companies sign pledges, let them try to plug the leaky pipeline, let them do all these smoke screens that they throw up to try to pretend to care about diversity. But if we really want this bazaar that Raymond described, we really want technology and open source software to be this big tent where everyone is welcome. Bring your ideas, bring your skills. Let's solve cool problems. Then we all have a role to play. You can make a difference. If we want LGBT people, if we want women, if we want people of color to not just get into technology, to not just get into open source software development, but to stay, to get promoted, to take leadership roles in technology, well, then you can make a difference by lending your privilege. Thank you.